Before there were scriptures, before temples or creeds, there was a name, not written but breathed, not declared but beheld, 4 letters, ancient, fragile, and powerful. YHWH. To speak them aloud was to pierce the veil between heaven and earth. To write them was to hold creation itself upon the tip of a reed. For the Hebrews, this name was not a title or description. It was existence. When Moses, standing before the flame that burned yet was not consumed, asked, "What is your name?" the answer came like thunder turned into thought. Ehyeh, Asher, Ehyeh, I am that I am. The God of Israel does not define himself by form or lineage, but by being itself. Not a being among others, but being as such. The pulse of existence, the hidden breath behind every motion. The letters Yod, He, Vav, He are not vowels or consonants alone. They are breaths. Whisper them and you will feel the rhythm of life itself. Inhale, exhale, creation, return. The name is not spoken, it is lived. Where did this God emerge from? This invisible one who forbade images, who spoke from fire and wind yet had no face. The earliest Israelite tribes did not arise in a vacuum. In the desert south of Canaan, travelers and traders called upon deities of storm and mountain, Yahweh of Teman, Yahweh of Seir, Yahweh of the south. Caravans crossing the copper-rich lands of Midian and Edom carried tales of a desert god who rode upon clouds and wielded lightning as his weapon. His voice was thunder, his presence fire. To those wandering herders, the world was a place of barrenness and power, where the divine revealed itself not through idols but through the elements themselves. Yahweh was not yet the sole creator of heaven and earth. He was the storm, the protector, the jealous guardian of a tribe's destiny. But even then, something set him apart. Where neighboring peoples saw their gods embodied in gold or stone, Yahweh demanded silence, a devotion expressed not in image but in covenant. In that absence of form, a new theology began to take shape. For when a God has no face, he may dwell anywhere, in fire or wind, in the conscience of man, in the word itself. Thus the name became not only sacred, but dangerous. By the time of the temple in Jerusalem, it could be spoken only once a year, by the high priest within the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant rested between golden cherubim. The sound of that utterance was believed to vibrate creation itself. So potent was the name that it was replaced in daily speech with Adonai, the Lord, or Hashem, the name. Every culture seeks to name the unnameable. The Egyptians had Amun, the hidden one. The Greeks spoke of pure being. The Hindus whispered Brahman, the soundless essence. But in Yahweh, there is something both austere and intimate. He does not dwell atop Olympus, nor in the depths of the underworld. He speaks from within the flame, and yet remains beyond it. To encounter Yahweh is to confront existence itself, to hear the echo of the words, I am that I am. The scholar sees in these 4 letters a linguistic relic, the mystic a key to the structure of creation, and the seeker a mirror reflecting the truth that the divine is not elsewhere. It is being. Before philosophy, before empire, before doctrine, there was this voice, a voice that does not describe itself but simply declares, I am. From this breath, from this name, all theology, all myth, all history that follows begins. To find Yahweh, one must return not to temples or scrolls, but to the wilderness. Before his name was etched in sacred text, it was carried on the wind through the red sands of Edom and the copper hills of Midian. Here, among nomads and caravan routes, the oldest echoes of his worship appear, in fragments of pottery, faint inscriptions and songs that spoke of Yahweh of Teman, Yahweh of Seir, the God who came from the south, riding on clouds and fire. Archaeologists speak of these as Yahweh deserts. There the air is dry, the earth scorched, and life itself depends on the mercy of the storm. In that landscape, the divine could only be understood as power, the thunder that shakes mountains, the wind that tears through the tents of men. The earliest Israelites were not city builders, they were wanderers. They saw the divine not in architecture but in survival. Yahweh was their protector, their storm, their vengeance against drought and enemy alike. In ancient hymns, his chariot is the cloud, his weapon the lightning. He strides upon the sea and scatters the nations with flame. He is called the one who rides upon the storm. In him we glimpse the memory of older gods, the Canaanite El, the storm lord Baal, the warrior god Hadad. But something about Yahweh begins to move beyond them. Where Baal was confined to a region, Yahweh began to claim the horizon itself. The heavens are mine, he says in the oldest fragments of Hebrew poetry. The earth also is mine, and all that dwell therein. This is not the voice of a local deity, this is the whisper of universality. Yet the transition from tribal God to universal Lord would take centuries, and it began here, among tents and stones, long before the scrolls of prophets or the psalms of kings. In the desert, every storm was judgment and mercy intertwined. Each flash of lightning revealed both the terror and the beauty of the unseen. The people who would become Israel learned to read the sky like scripture. They saw in its vastness both their fragility and their calling. Yahweh was not yet the moral lawgiver nor the cosmic creator. He was the living force, a God who moved with his people, demanding loyalty in exchange for survival. And from that raw intimacy, the fear of the storm, the gratitude for rain, a covenantal relationship began to form. Ancient inscriptions speak of Yahweh's consort, Asherah, a remnant of the goddess tradition that preceded monotheism. In the early highlands of Israel, clay figures of mother goddesses stood beside altars to Yahweh. The people had not yet separated the masculine from the feminine, the thunder from the womb of creation. But the prophets to come would strip away these older symbols. The image of Yahweh would grow purer, starker, until only the unseen voice remained. Yet one can still sense in those early centuries the pulse of the earth in his name. Yahweh was the storm over Sinai, the trembling of the mountain, the fire that does not consume. He was immediacy, not philosophy, but encounter. And it is from this encounter that a nation's identity would be born. In time, tribes that once spoke of many gods would gather their myths, their victories, their tragedies into a single narrative. We are the people of Yahweh. He would become the heart of their story, the one who delivers from bondage, who guides through wilderness, who commands justice and mercy in equal breath. Out of the harsh wind and blinding light, the first concept of the one God began to take shape. In the silence between thunder and echo, the world was being rewritten. From the dust of the desert, Yahweh would rise, and the age of tribes would give way to the age of covenant. As the tribes of Israel settled the highlands of Canaan, Yahweh's story changed. He was no longer the lone God of the wilderness, stalking storms across the southern sky. He had become the God of a people, a covenant woven not through lightning but through law. The shepherd god of nomads was now the guardian of a growing nation. In the hills above the fertile valleys, small sanctuaries arose, rough altars of uncut stone. Smoke from offerings drifted upward, merging with the clouds as if carrying petitions to the unseen. There the name of Yahweh was invoked beside older deities: El, the father of gods; Baal, the bringer of rain; Asherah, the life-giver. In that early period, Israel was not yet monotheistic, it was monolatrous. The people acknowledged the existence of other divine beings, but swore allegiance to one above all others. "You shall have no other gods before me," said the voice at Sinai, a command not denying other powers, but forbidding their worship. Yahweh had entered the stage of history as the exclusive, not yet the only God. Yet exclusivity breeds transformation. In choosing one God, Israel reimagined divinity itself, no longer bound to a place or image, but to a relationship. In the earliest hymns, Yahweh's court was still crowded. The Psalms speak of him standing among the gods, the divine council over which he presides. But slowly that council fell silent. Where once Yahweh ruled among equals, now he alone creates, judges, and redeems. The pantheon dissolves into his shadow, the many faces of divinity collapse into one flame. The shift was not purely theological, it was existential. In the competing world of empires, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, each nation claimed its own gods as patrons of power. For a small people caught between giants, faith became identity. To be faithful to Yahweh was to remain distinct, preserved against assimilation. Religion became survival. Prophets rose, fierce voices who spoke not in myth but in warning. They denounced idols, condemned injustice, and declared that Yahweh demanded righteousness more than ritual. "What does the Lord require of you?" asked Micah, "but to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God?" In those words, the idea of God began to turn inward. Yahweh was no longer only the storm above, he had become the conscience within. Yet even as prophets purified the idea of the divine, the people still longed for presence. Thus rose the dream of a temple, a house for the invisible. Under Solomon, that dream took form. Massive stones quarried and laid upon Mount Moriah, cedar from Lebanon carved into cherubim and lions, gold leaf shimmering in torchlight. At the center stood the Holy of Holies, a chamber sealed in silence. There rested the Ark of the Covenant, a chest of acacia wood overlaid with gold, said to contain the tablets of law. Between the wings of its cherubim, Yahweh was enthroned, invisible yet enthroned nonetheless. No image dared portray him. The void itself became his presence. In that emptiness lay a profound declaration: the divine is not what the eyes can see, but what the mind can revere. Israel's neighbors filled their temples with statues. Jerusalem's sanctuary held only silence. The world's first theology of transcendence had taken shape. Yahweh was not merely the mightiest among gods, he was the very ground of power, the source from which gods derive their being. Slowly, a revolution of thought unfolded. The heavens were no longer a divine neighborhood, but the expression of one will. The stars moved by command, the seasons by decree. History itself became a moral stage. Success or disaster, victory or exile, all understood as dialogue with the One. Yahweh had become both author and audience of human fate, yet this transformation carried a price. The intimacy of the desert was fading. The God who once walked with his people in the wilderness now dwelt behind curtains of gold and smoke. His voice mediated through priests and prophets. The divine grew distant yet also immense, no longer confined to thunderclouds but stretching across time and cosmos. The people would have to learn to seek him not in the mountain, nor the temple alone, but in the unfolding of history itself. Yahweh was becoming the God of everything. To understand Yahweh, one must understand the covenant, the thread that binds eternity to the fragile heart of man. A covenant is not merely a contract, it is a marriage between heaven and earth, a bond written not on paper but on the soul of a people. For the Israelites, Yahweh was not a distant abstraction. He was their liberator, the one who led them out of Egypt, who fed them in the wilderness, who commanded, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." Holiness, kadosh, meant separation, distinction, a people set apart for a divine purpose. The covenant defined that purpose. It established the terms of relationship between the infinite and the finite. Yahweh would bless and protect his people, but they, in turn, were to walk in obedience, justice, and remembrance. This was a revolution in theology, for the gods of the ancient world were unpredictable, their favor bought by sacrifice, their moods bound to weather and war. But Yahweh introduced something else, ethical reciprocity. Morality became the true sacrifice. The prophets would cry, "I desire mercy, not burnt offerings." To serve Yahweh was no longer merely ritual. It was to live in alignment with his moral order. And yet ritual remained the language of the age. When Solomon's temple rose upon Mount Moriah, the covenant found its home. Built from limestone and cedar, inlaid with gold and precious stones, the temple was not only a structure, it was cosmos made visible. Its architecture mirrored the universe itself, the outer court, the world of man, the holy place, the domain of the angels, and at its heart, the Holy of Holies, the unseen throne of God. Within that inner chamber rested the Ark of the Covenant, said to hold the tablets of the law given to Moses on Sinai, the tangible proof of divine speech. Over the ark, two cherubim faced one another, wings outstretched, forming a space of emptiness between them. That space, that sacred void, was Yahweh's throne. No idol, no image, no likeness, only absence filled with presence. When the high priest entered once a year, bearing the blood of atonement, he stood before that void and uttered the ineffable name. The people waited in silence outside, hearts trembling. In that silence, they believed heaven and earth touched. The temple became the meeting place between worlds, the axis of creation, the center of moral gravity, and around it life was ordered. Sabbaths, feasts, sacrifices, pilgrimages. The rhythm of Israel's days was the rhythm of its theology. Every harvest and every year of Jubilee retold the story of liberation, that the God who delivered from bondage now demanded that his people deliver one another from oppression. The covenant was not a static decree, it was a living dialogue between the Creator and his creation. Break it, and the land would wither, honor it, and even the barren would bloom. But as the centuries passed, prosperity dulled vigilance. Kings grew proud, priests complacent, ritual replaced righteousness. The voice of the prophets thundered through the corridors of power. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourselves clean. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Israel had mistaken covenant for privilege. They had forgotten that divine favor was not inheritance, it was responsibility. Then came the catastrophe. In 586 BCE, the Babylonian armies breached the walls of Jerusalem. The temple, the house of Yahweh, was burned. The ark vanished into legend. The people were led into exile. The chosen nation scattered in chains. To the ancient mind, this was unthinkable. How could the dwelling place of the Almighty fall? Had Yahweh abandoned his people, or was this destruction itself his judgment, a purifying fire to renew the covenant in spirit rather than stone? In the dust of that ruin, the next transformation of faith began. The temple was gone, but the name endured, and so the voice that once thundered from Sinai began to speak again. Not from pillars of cloud or burning altars, but through the pens of prophets and the poetry of exiles. Yahweh was not dead. He had simply moved from the temple of stone into the temple of memory, conscience, and scripture. The covenant would survive, but it would no longer be bound to place. It would be written upon the heart. The smoke of Jerusalem's ruins drifted eastward, carrying with it the ashes of certainty. For generations, the Israelites had believed the covenant guaranteed their survival, that as long as the temple stood, Yahweh's presence would never depart. But now the house of God was rubble, and his people marched in chains to Babylon. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept. When we remembered Zion, faith itself trembled. How could the Almighty be defeated? Was Marduk, the god of Babylon, stronger than Yahweh? The exile forced a reckoning deeper than defeat. It demanded a new vision of God. The prophets rose amid the despair. Ezekiel, by the Chebar River, beheld a vision of wheels within wheels, living creatures of fire and light, and above them a throne, not in Jerusalem, but in the heavens. The message was revolutionary. Yahweh was not confined to the temple. His presence could dwell anywhere, even among captives in a foreign land. In that realization, the God of Israel became the God of all creation. Exile shattered the idea of a national deity and birthed the vision of a universal one. The loss of land became the expansion of heaven. The whole earth is full of his glory, cried Isaiah. Out of ruin, monotheism was born in its purest form. No longer a tribal guardian, Yahweh emerged as the unseen architect of history, the cause of both disaster and deliverance. He was no longer merely Israel's God, he was God, period. From that fire of exile came the understanding that even judgment is an act of mercy, that destruction can become purification, that covenant can be renewed in the heart, prophecy turned inward. The divine was no longer sought in burnt offerings, but in repentance, in justice, in remembrance. Out of Babylon's libraries came another revolution, the written word as sacred space. With the temple gone, scripture became the new dwelling of the divine. The Torah, the prophets, the histories, each scroll a stone in the invisible temple of memory. When the exiles returned under Cyrus of Persia, they carried no ark, no image, no relic. They carried text, the architecture of faith written in ink and breath. From this, Judaism as we know it began to form, a religion not of land or idol, but of law and word. Yahweh had survived conquest by transforming himself. The God who once dwelt in fire and thunder now dwelt in mind and meaning. In the exile's darkness, faith evolved from obedience to understanding, from sacrifice to symbolism, from presence to transcendence. The divine was no longer seen, it was known. Yahweh had become invisible, but in that invisibility he became infinite. The covenant endured, no longer carved in stone, but whispered in the conscience of man. The prophet spoke of a new promise, a day when God would write his law upon human hearts. It was the dawn of inward religion, the birth of faith as reflection rather than ritual. Yahweh had withdrawn from the visible world only to be discovered in the unseen depths of thought and spirit. What began as defeat became revelation. The exile meant to erase a nation, instead eternalized its God. From Babylon's shadows emerged the light of a new theology, a God beyond place, beyond image, whose voice could echo in every heart that dared to listen. Out of exile came not only faith, but philosophy. The question once whispered by prophets, "Who is Yahweh?" began to demand a new kind of answer. The ancient poets had spoken of a God who walked in gardens, who thundered from mountains, who rode upon clouds. But the scribes and scholars who followed sought a deeper meaning behind the imagery, not merely what Yahweh did, but what he was. The trauma of exile had stripped away every visible certainty. What remained was the invisible, being itself. The God who once appeared as fire now appeared as thought. The priest and the philosopher began to meet in the same sentence. To name Yahweh was to name the ground of existence, he who is, not he who was or he who will be. In Exodus, the revelation, "I am that I am," became a doorway, a phrase through which mystics and thinkers alike began to walk. The Greeks, too, were asking similar questions. What is the substance of reality? What endures when all else changes? When Hebrew thinkers encountered Greek philosophy, the conversation between faith and reason was born. In Yahweh's self-declaration, "I am," the philosopher heard what Plato would call the form of the good, and what Aristotle would describe as the unmoved mover. The divine was no longer a character in myth. It was the principle of being itself. Yet for the Hebrew mind, this realization did not erase the personal. It deepened it. Yahweh was both transcendent and near, infinite and intimate, the cause of existence and the companion in suffering. In this duality, infinite yet personal, monotheism reached its philosophical maturity. The universe, once imagined as a stage for many gods, was now seen as the expression of a single intelligence, a unity not of politics, but of being. When the sages of Israel spoke of the word, they meant not simply speech, but the very pattern through which the cosmos unfolds. In Greek, that pattern would be called logos, the reason of the universe, the bridge between mind and matter, God and creation. In later centuries, this idea would shape the Gospels themselves. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Thus Yahweh, once imagined as fire and storm, became logos, order, purpose, consciousness. The Jewish philosophers of Alexandria, like Philo, described the divine as both transcendent and immanent, beyond the world, yet expressing himself through it. Philo would write, "God alone exists in reality, all else exists by participation." That thought would echo through the centuries, shaping Christian theology, Islamic philosophy, and Western metaphysics itself. The evolution of Yahweh was not the loss of the sacred, it was its intellectual ascent. The God of Abraham had become the God of being, the one in whom all existence finds its root. The prophets had cried that the Holy One cannot be contained in a house of stone. The philosophers now declared, he cannot be contained even in the mind, for the mind itself is his reflection. Yahweh had become not only Lord of history, but the principle of intelligibility itself. Every law of nature, every mathematical truth, every moral intuition, all were seen as shadows of his infinite logic. This was no longer religion alone, it was ontology, the study of being wrapped in the language of worship. When men prayed, they no longer cried only to the sky. They spoke into the mystery of their own consciousness. To know Yahweh was to know reality itself. The storm god of Sinai had become the architect of the cosmos. The jealous deity of tribes had become the mind behind creation. And yet, for all this philosophical refinement, his name still burned with the same elemental simplicity, I am. Scholars could dissect, poets could interpret, mystics could ascend, but the name remained a whisper beyond all understanding. In that paradox, where intellect meets mystery, Yahweh ceased to be only an answer. He became the eternal question at the root of existence. The divine had moved from temple to scroll, from symbol to thought. Yet another transformation awaited, one that would seek not only to know Yahweh, but to experience him as the inner pattern of the soul itself. After philosophy comes vision. When language reaches its limit, the mystic begins to speak in symbols. Within the Jewish mystical tradition, the Kabbalah, the name of Yahweh is not merely a word. It is a map of existence, a pattern through which creation unfolds. The four sacred letters, Yod, He, Vav, He, are not sounds but stages, four emanations of divine energy descending into form. Yod, the point, the spark, the seed of potential. He, the breath, expansion, the womb that receives the spark. Vav, the line that connects heaven and earth, the axis of manifestation. He, again, the return, the echo of creation completed in reflection. Together these letters trace the rhythm of the cosmos. Emanation arrow, creation arrow, formation arrow, manifestation. For the mystic, to meditate on the name is to align oneself with the pulse of reality. The tetragrammaton is not pronunciation, it is breathwork, geometry, being. The Kabbalists taught that the universe exists through the constant contraction and expansion of divine energy, Tzimtzum, the self-limitation of God to make space for creation. Yahweh, in this view, is both presence and absence, fullness and withdrawal. Creation is not something he does, it is something he is. The Zohar, the great mystical text of the Kabbalah, describes the letters of the name as flames bound together. Each letter burns into the next, forming not a static title but a living pattern of motion. To contemplate the name is to glimpse the machinery of the divine mind. In Kabbalistic diagrams, this pattern becomes the tree of life. 10 emanations, or sephirot, through which infinite light descends into the finite world. At its summit, Keter, the crown, represents the unknowable essence of Yahweh, too pure even for thought. Beneath it flow Chokmah and Binah, wisdom and understanding, the twin aspects of divine mind. From these, the universe unfolds downward through love, judgment, beauty, foundation, and finally into Malkuth, the physical realm, the kingdom, where matter itself is the last echo of divinity. The mystics did not worship this tree. They studied it as one studies anatomy, the anatomy of God's inner life. Each human soul, they said, mirrors that same structure. To ascend the tree in meditation is to return from multiplicity to unity, to climb back into the hidden heart of Yahweh. In this mystical vision, the act of knowing God is also the act of becoming whole. The name, then, is not a label, it is an invitation. To pronounce it truly, one must live in harmony with the cosmic order it describes. Mystics wrote of the divine breath, the vibration that sustains creation, a hum beneath all things, a resonance between soul and source. In their silence they claimed to hear it. For them, Yahweh was not somewhere else. He was the pattern within. Each thought, each heartbeat, each breath was a microcosm of the sacred name unfolding and returning. The divine was not an external king, but an inner architecture of consciousness. When later Christian mystics and Islamic Sufis encountered these ideas, they recognized the same truth in their own tongues, that to know God is to know oneself as his expression. In every language, in every faith, the name remains the same mystery, the unspoken syllable of being itself. And though theologians might debate its meaning, the mystic smiles, for he knows the secret cannot be told, only experienced. In the Kabbalah, they say creation began with a point of light that exploded into 10,000 forms, and that every act of understanding draws that light back home. Thus, to speak the name of Yahweh is not to utter a sound. It is to awaken. Every revelation that humanity receives about God eventually becomes a revelation about itself. For in seeking the divine, we have always been staring into a mirror. The mystics of every age understood this, that the image of Yahweh was never a portrait of a distant being, but a reflection of the deepest structures of human consciousness. In the beginning, Yahweh thundered outside us, in storm, in fire, in mountain, in law, but slowly the voice that once echoed from without began to whisper from within. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. This was not poetry, it was transformation. The God of Israel had entered the human psyche, and once within, he began to reshape it. Ludwig Feuerbach would later write, "Man creates God in his own image, and then forgets that he has done so." But perhaps the truth is subtler, that God is the archetype of our highest potential, the eternal symbol of what the soul might become when it awakens to its own light. To ancient mystics, Yahweh's commandments were not external demands. They were mirrors of the inner life. "Thou shalt not murder" spoke not only to the hand, but to the heart that harbors hate. "Thou shalt not covet" revealed the restless hunger of the ego. The moral law was a map, the shadow of divine order reflected in the chaos of the human soul. In this mirror, Yahweh becomes the symbol of conscience, the voice that calls man out of instinct into awareness. Carl Jung, the depth psychologist, described this as the self, the totality of being that guides the ego toward wholeness. He saw in Yahweh's paradoxes the drama of the human mind itself, wrath and mercy, justice and forgiveness, destruction and creation, all opposites yearning for reconciliation. To Jung, the figure of Yahweh in Scripture was not a distant monarch, but the image of the psyche wrestling with its own divinity. The story of Job, for instance, is not merely about suffering. It is the confrontation of consciousness with the shadow of the divine, the dialogue between finite understanding and infinite mystery. In that tension between human and divine light and shadow, Yahweh becomes not only the creator of man, but the symbol of man's ongoing creation of himself. Each moral choice, each act of compassion, each moment of clarity in the darkness of confusion is a small reenactment of Genesis. "Let there be light," says the voice of Yahweh, and within the human soul a thought awakens. To live, then, is to participate in the ongoing act of divine creation. Every breath is a covenant. Every heartbeat is a commandment renewed. The mystics saw this clearly, that Yahweh's presence is not confined to any temple, but flickers in the consciousness of every being that can say, "I am." For when man speaks those words, "I am," He echoes the divine utterance from the burning bush. The smallest spark of self-awareness is already participation in the divine. This is the ultimate mystery, that the same force that set the galaxies in motion also breathes behind the eyes that gaze upon them. Yahweh is both the source and the witness, the mind of the cosmos and the awareness within the creature who contemplates it. The human being, in all his fragility and longing, becomes the vessel through which God sees himself reflected. Thus, creation is not a past event, it is a present awakening. To awaken to consciousness is to allow Yahweh to become aware of himself through us, and perhaps this has always been his purpose. For every question man has asked of God has always been God asking the same question through man. The divine and the human are not two, they are a dialogue, endlessly unfolding across the mirror of time. The name Yahweh once thundered from the mountain, but as the centuries unfolded it began to speak in new tongues. From the ashes of ancient Israel rose three great faiths, each a different reflection of the same divine fire. In Judaism, Yahweh remained the eternal, unseen, indivisible, holy, beyond speech. The rabbis built fences of reverence around his name so that even the breath that might utter it became an act of worship. In Christianity, the Word became flesh, and the ineffable found voice in the figure of Jesus of Nazareth, whose declaration, "Before Abraham was, I am," echoed the same voice that spoke from the burning bush. The Christian vision reinterpreted Yahweh not as distant sovereignty, but as incarnate love, the infinite entering the finite, the eternal wearing the mask of time. And in Islam, Yahweh's name took new shape as Allah, the One, the Merciful, the same uncreated light perceived through the lens of a new revelation. He is Allah the One, Allah the eternal refuge. He begets not, nor is he begotten, and there is none like unto him. The divine unity first glimpsed in the deserts of Edom had now become the cornerstone of civilization, carried by poets, saints, and scholars across continents and millennia. But with power came peril. The same fire that illuminated the soul could also consume it. When the vision of the One became property of the few, religion hardened into empire and truth was enforced by sword instead of spirit. The God who once whispered freedom to slaves was invoked to justify kings and crusades, yet even in those dark ages the mystics remembered. They whispered that the divine cannot be owned or confined, that Yahweh lives wherever consciousness awakens. In their silence, the pure monotheism of the heart endured, not as dogma, but as a recognition that being itself is sacred. The philosophers of the Enlightenment would take this insight further still. To them, Yahweh became nature's God, the architect of rational order. Spinoza would speak of Deus sive natura, God or nature, seeing in the laws of physics the very thoughts of the divine. The god of thunder had become the god of reason. Yet as science expanded, faith was forced to evolve once more. Some began to see Yahweh not as a cosmic personality, but as a metaphor for the unity of existence, the mysterious coherence that binds all things together. Others rejected the symbol entirely, declaring that God was no longer needed to explain the universe. But even in this rejection, the imprint of the old idea remained: the pursuit of truth, the hunger for order, the moral law within, all were inheritances of the Yahwistic vision. Even the atheist who seeks truth above comfort stands unknowingly in the lineage of the prophets. For Yahweh was never merely a name, he was a principle. that truth, unity, and justice are not human inventions, but reflections of something eternal. Whether one kneels in prayer or peers through a telescope, the same mystery gazes back. It is the mystery of existence itself, silent, vast, and unyielding to definition. Yahweh has outlived the idols built in his honor, the temples raised in his name, and even the languages that once spoke him aloud. He has become a symbol woven into the DNA of civilization, the unspoken assumption behind our laws, our ethics, our very concept of personhood. For the belief that every human being bears intrinsic worth, that the slave and the king are equal before the unseen, was not born from empire or economy. It was born from the desert voice that said, "I am that I am." That declaration, echoing through millennia, planted the seed of dignity in the human mind. Even those who have forgotten the name still live within its shadow. The God of Abraham has become the question of philosophy, the light of mysticism, the silence behind the scientists, or whether one calls him Yahweh, Allah, Logos, or the universe. The mystery remains, and the human heart, restless as ever, continues to seek the face that cannot be seen. The story of Yahweh begins in the desert and ends in silence. 4 letters, unspoken yet eternal. Yod, He, Vav, He. Across 3,000 years, those letters have traveled from mountain to mind, from fire to philosophy, from the trembling of nomads to the musings of scholars and saints. Yet their essence has not changed. They still name what cannot be named. For to say Yahweh is not to speak a word, it is to acknowledge a mystery, that behind the endless patterns of matter and mind there is awareness, a pulse, a presence, a being that simply is. I am. Those 2 syllables contain all of history, all of consciousness, all of longing. They are the first truth and the final answer. In the breath between those words, and between I and am, lies the whole drama of creation, the awakening of the universe to itself. The desert tribes who once called upon Yahweh sought protection and purpose. The philosophers who later pondered his nature sought meaning and coherence, but the mystics understood that the journey outward is the journey inward, that to know Yahweh is to awaken to the realization that existence itself is sacred and that the divine is not elsewhere. It is the silence listening through you now. Close your eyes, feel your breath. Inhale, Yod, exhale, He. The pulse of life continues, Vav, He. Every breath a renewal of the ancient covenant. Every moment the world speaks the name anew, for as long as there is breath, the mystery endures. The theologian may define, the philosopher may reason, the skeptic may doubt, but the breath remains. It whispers through all things, I am. The light that burns in the star and the awareness that sees the star are not 2. They are one. That oneness is Yahweh, not as a figure to be worshipped, but as the truth to be remembered, a truth older than any creed and closer than your own heartbeat. For the name that cannot be spoken was never meant for the tongue, it was meant for the soul. And so, the story returns to where it began, a voice in the wilderness, a spark in the mind, a question that will never fade. Who is Yahweh? Perhaps the answer is this, the breath that asks the question. You've been watching the Esoteric Unveiled, exploring hidden orders, forgotten truths, and forbidden knowledge. Like and subscribe.